Hi, this is Nick Walters, the founder of the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. We are glad to have yet another conversation about something very interesting that happens this week in Christian history. And we are talking today with Tom Meeks, who is the Associate Director of the General Lew Wallace Study and Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana, to talk about General Lew Wallace and a famous book that he wrote. Many people who don't probably, Tom, don't know the full title, right? Which is Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. And Tom and I are going to have an opportunity to talk today about General Wallace and about the book as well. So, Tom, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, tell us just a little bit before we actually talk about General Wallace and being able to talk about the book. Tell us about the center that's there in Crawfordsville and how that all came
Yeah.
about.
So right now I am sitting in General Lew Wallace's study. It is today a museum, but it's a building he built late in life after he wrote Ben-Hur. Built it with the money he made off Ben-Hur.
Okay.
To be as he said, a pleasure house for his soul. He wanted a place where he could just bury himself in a den of books and paint if he wanted to, play music if he wanted to do his violin, read, of course, write, and not be bothered. Kind of wanted to, put himself in seclusion in here so he could focus on his work.
How about that? And so is it kind of a spot behind his home, or help us with the visual? Is it down a couple of blocks away, or
Yeah,
where is it
so
at?
so we are what was his home is unfortunately no longer there. Uh, there is a house there, but it's been remodeled extensively. He built this building though basically in his backyard. There
Ah,
was a spot he loved to write outside. Now a statue stands there, and but before the statue was a big beech tree, beautiful beech tree, and he
huh.
loved to write under it. He would set up a platform with a rocking chair and a lap desk, sometimes build a tent over it, and he loved to work outside if he could. And just 20 feet away from that area, he eventually built this building. And now, like I said, today it's a museum. It became a museum in the 1940s. And
Oh,
before that, it was owned by the family, but didn't, it kind of acted as a museum, but it didn't officially become one until the 40s. So.
how about that? Well, great. Well, tell us more about Lew Wallace and kind of just give us some background on him and some of the really cool things that he got to do. My gracious, all the different things that one human did in a lifetime. No wonder he's got a museum to him for all of that work that he did. And then let's talk a little bit more about that, about specifically, let's talk about Ben-Hur and how that came about.
Sure. So Lew Wallace, and I'm a biased person working here, but to me,
Sure.
Lew Wallace he's an American hero. He is a Renaissance man, first and foremost. He could do almost anything. He could approach almost any topic and do it well. He's born on April 10th of 1827 to David Wallace and Esther French Test. Esther French Wallace.
Okay.
Unfortunately, when he's a boy, his mother passes away when he's about 5 years old.
Mm.
His father, about that time, was lieutenant governor of Indiana. When he's 9, when he turns 9, his father's elected to be the actual governor. So as a boy, his father, he loses his mother at a young age, and his father is so busy with politics that he's not around that often. So Lew, as a boy, is able to just, raise himself. He loves adventure. He loves to explore the untamed woods of what was then frontier Indiana. Uh, uh, he wasn't particularly good at school as a boy. He, writes about, tells stories in his autobiography about getting hit by teachers, there's one story that I find hard to believe, but apparently on his first day of school, a little girl next to him ate his pencil, literally ate the pencil. So the teacher punished him for not having a pencil. Uh, there's another one of my favorite stories of his boyhood, and he's got to be 13 at this point. He runs. His father's in office in Indianapolis, so Lew is living in Indianapolis with his father, and he runs away from home because he loves adventure. He wants to get out there and experience the world. He runs away from home to attend the Tippecanoe and Tyler II speech by William Henry Harrison, one of the most famous
Really?
presidential speeches in U.S. history. And he goes
Sure.
to attend it, runs away from home as a 13-year-old boy. So he's very politically in tune from a young age, probably because his father was governor, but loved adventure. As he gets older, the Mexican-American War breaks out when he's about 19. He joins that. Uh, uh, After the war, he starts practicing law. He gets married to Susan, and when we get into Ben-Hur, I can elaborate a little on her. But there is no Lew Wallace without Susan Wallace. She is
Wow.
so important to him. It's everything he ever did, he attributed to her. So he gets married, and in the late 1850s, he's involved with politics, and he's involved with a militia company, and that militia company gains statewide fame. So as 1861 comes around and the Civil War starts to break out, the governor then, Oliver P. Morton of Indiana, calls on Lew Wallace because he knows his name from his fame as a militia leader, and makes him the adjutant general at the outbreak of the war, and charges him with recruiting all of the men. Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. Well, Indiana's quota was 6,000 men. Lew starts sending out telegrams, flyers, contacting everybody in Indiana he can to recruit. And the quota was 6,000 men. Well, 13,000 showed up to
Wow.
volunteer their services. So he was tasked with organizing them into their regiments. Well, Lew told Oliver Morton, I will accept this position, but only under the circumstance that I am given command of one of those regiments. So he takes command of the 11th Indiana at the outbreak of the war, about a week after organizing 13, just the logistics of organizing 13,000 men in a week. Throughout the Civil War, though, he's the colonel of the 11th early on. He's promoted to brigadier general. Fort Henry and Donelson happened. Shiloh, he's promoted to major general after those. Shiloh happens, and he has a big falling out at Shiloh. I suggest reading some of that stuff too. That's probably the biggest stain on his military career, but it can be argued. It's been argued by historians for, going on
Right.
150 years now, 200 years. So he's put on the shelf after Shiloh and taken out of active duty. He would sit on the Buell Commission during that time. He would help with the siege of Cincinnati during that time. But then Abraham Lincoln himself personally puts Lew back in charge of some troops in Maryland, puts him in charge of the Middle Department, gives him control of about 6,000, 8,000 troops in the state of Maryland. And then the Battle of Monocacy happens. And that's probably the battle he's most famous for outside of Shiloh. After the war, he's involved with two of the most controversial and high-profile trials in U.S. history. He's part of the Abraham Lincoln conspirators trial, and then he's also part of the Henry Wirz Andersonville prison Commandant Henry Wirz trial.
Huh.
He's the president of that one. Again, both of those very significant, very controversial today. In the period after the war, he's looking for a way to get away from practicing the law. He, at this point in life, detested the law. So he resigns his commission from the United States military and joins the Mexican army, is commissioned there by Benito Juarez and the Juaristas to help Benito Juarez retake control of the Mexican government.
Wow.
Many Civil War veterans did that, I believe, on both sides. I could be wrong. And then he begins writing. We can get into that here in a little bit. But in 1878, President Rutherford B. Hayes, makes him the territorial governor of New Mexico. While he's in New Mexico, he deals with Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County range wars there. He deals with some of the land disputes with Victorio and the Apaches. After New Mexico, he's made the well, at this time it's called minister, but today we would know it as an ambassador to the Ottoman Empire or Turkey. And while he's in Turkey, he forms a very close relationship with the Sultan. They were true friends with each other. During his time there, he travels to the Holy Land. He travels, all throughout that empire there, and then eventually comes home and builds the study. Not too long after that we were talking about. So,
well, that's about what time period is that he's back from the Ottoman Empire?
So he comes back 1885.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And
then
the study's not built till.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
That when he's coming home from there, he actually writes his wife saying, I want to build a study. I want this pleasure house for my soul, is where that quote comes from. And it would take him 10 years, but in 1895, he eventually builds the study with the money he makes off of Ben-Hur.
Okay. All right. Well, talk about that for just a minute. I'd love to be able to make sure everybody understands how a guy that's just got this, as you say, a Renaissance man, right? I mean, that's got so many things going on in his head that made him even want to be able to write the book in the first place. I mean, how did that germinate?
Yeah. So relating back to his childhood, he was not the greatest student. He absolutely hated math, but he loved to read and write. He loved to read. I mean, and as I said earlier, he loved adventure. So he could almost project himself into these faraway worlds through reading. Read a novel and project himself into that to kind of satisfy that need for adventure.
Mm-hmm.
He's again looking for ways to get away from practicing the law. So he starts after the war writing, and he picks up a book that's called The Fair God. He had been writing it for nearly 30 years. Put it down, picked it up, put it down, picked it up, and after the war picks it up and finishes it finally in 1873. And that book, again called The Fair God, is all about the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. It dealt with a lot of the discovery of the New World, and how the Aztecs. It's written from the Aztec point of view, and shows how they perceived these Spanish conquerors at the time. From there, though, he gains some confidence after that's released. It's released and does fairly well. Not what Ben-Hur would do, but he begins thinking, well, what can I do next? What can I write next? And from as far as he could remember from being a boy, he was always fascinated with the story of the three magi, seeing the star in the east, receiving the message that Jesus, that the new King of the Jews is born from the star of the east. So he is fascinated with this tale, but he has all these unanswered questions. He was told that tale by his mother as a boy, but has all these unanswered questions. Who are these men? How did they travel across the desert at that time? How did they receive a message from a star? So he starts writing this piece, and he thinks early on that this piece is going to be just a magazine serial, just a series of articles that come out in a magazine every month that have illustrations with it, what have you,
Sure.
to tell the story of the three magi. As he is in that process, he's realizing, oh, the birth of Jesus, this is a really good beginning. This is a start of a big story, the birth of Jesus. And then he starts thinking, well, what's the logical end of that story? The crucifixion is what the logical end is. And if you follow through Ben-Hur, that's what it starts and ends at. But as with the wise men, he had all these unanswered questions about the people, the politics, the culture of the time. And he realizes that, well, Christians will not accept a story in which Jesus is the main character. They will be very offended by that. Some will consider it as blasphemy. And this is in the 1870s,
Sure.
different than it is today. So he starts filling in the time between the birth and the crucifixion with these stories of people, these stories of the politics, these stories of the culture of that time. And that's where he starts making that transition to the story of Judah Ben-Hur.
How about that? Hey, look, we're talking with Tom Meeks, who's the associate director of the General Lew Wallace Study Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana, learning a heck of a lot more about General Lew Wallace, the author of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. This is some great information that we're getting from you, Tom. So yeah, keep going, keep telling us more. That's great.
Sure. So along the way here, actually, it's in September of 1876. Lew Wallace has he hops on a train headed to Indianapolis from Crawfordsville. We're today about an hour drive from Indianapolis. Back then, it's probably a 2-hour train ride. And he's walking up the train aisle and hears a tap on a window and looks over, and there's a gentleman who's inviting him into the car with him. And that gentleman was a man named Robert G. Ingersoll. I
Okay.
don't know if you know much about him.
Assume I don't.
Okay, I will. I will explain a little bit, and then I'll get into what happens with him. Robert Ingersoll was famous in the late 1800s, early 1900s, during the Age of Enlightenment, for going around the country, touring the country, giving speeches on agnosticism and on trying to convince people to leave their church. Ingersoll, was raised in a devoutly Christian family. His father was a preacher, and his father was ran out of town by multiple congregations for preaching religious tolerance, for preaching accepting people who are different than you.
Huh.
So he's run out of town multiple times, and this makes Robert Ingersoll grow up despising the church and despising religion because he saw what it did to his father and what it did to him being forced to move town to town to town as a boy, because congregations weren't accepting that idea. So he dedicates his life to getting people to leave their churches. Well, Lew comes across this man in the train ride. It turns out that Ingersoll served at Shiloh. They recognized each other,
Huh.
invites him in the car, and Lew says, "Sure, I'll sit with you as long as you let me dictate the conversation." And Lew, knowing who this guy is, says, "I want to hear what you have to say about the Christian faith." And Lew says he sat there spellbound as this guy, like he was stunned as this guy is going on of a complete excoriation of the divinity of Christ, of every single story he could think of in the Bible at that time. And Lew, this is in the middle of him writing Ben-Hur,
Hmm.
and while his first book dealt with the a lot with the Catholic and Aztec religions, this book Ben-Hur deals a lot with the Christian faith, and he realizes from this conversation how little he knew about Christianity at that time.
I
And
got you.
up to this
So
point,
this agnostic is teaching him things that he was like, gosh, I should know that, and I don't really kind of know
yeah,
something
and
like that.
yes, and he realizes how important this topic is. Up to that point, he was very indifferent towards that topic. He was he had always heard people arguing back and forth about it. He had always thought he was a believer, maybe, but he was really just indifferent. He didn't know what he believed. He didn't know enough about the topic. But this conversation with Ingersoll challenges him and makes him realize how little he knows and how important the topic is. So he sets out to start researching the topic, and adding more of that into his book. And he's not just researching what he believes, but what you're supposed to believe.
Mm.
And through his research, he comes out of it saying, I have, he comes out of it thinking, I have, an absolute belief in the divinity of Christ. He after researching it thoroughly, he went through everything he could. If you see the books behind me,
Yeah.
every single book here is a religious text of some sort. He set out, and like I said, doing this research to learn more about it, and came out of it thinking to himself that he had an absolute belief in Christ. Now, the book comes out, and Robert Ingersoll, and it's a huge hit, right? Well, I would say maybe 17, 18 years after the book is released, he re-releases the first book of it, which is all about the three magi. But there's a new introduction in that book, and he gives credit to Ingersoll for inspiring him to write this book. So it's
Wow.
really ironic that the most famous agnostic in US history inspired the most famous Christian novel of all time. And it's kind of interesting. It's also ironic that up to that point, Lew was somewhat indifferent towards religion. But then he comes away from it after Ben-Hur's, released. He says, in his after he credits Ingersoll for the inspiration, and after his third book, which was called The Prince of India, which is all about the fall of Constantinople, and deals a lot more with Muslim faith, he starts receiving so much criticism about his personal faith. And the criticism gets so bad for Lew that the very first paragraph of his autobiography, the very first thing he says is, I believe absolutely in the divinity of Christ. How he describes it, though, is that he believes that Christ was a human being, a real human being, and that God was the spirit that was within him. And that spirit, he says is, within all of us, in a sense.
Interesting. So he had a lot of, I would assume that he was not really prepared to have all these deep theological discussions with people who were
No.
coming at him left and right in different pieces and understanding, oh my gracious, there's all this theology and there's all this different doctrine and there's all this different
Yeah.
denominations, and this one didn't like that one because they think the other one's wrong and they're right.
Yeah.
And that whole world was probably something way more than he tipped off
Well,
or wanted to tip off into.
yes, and Lew himself says he was never a part of any church. His wife was. His wife was actually raised a Quaker. She went to a
Hmm.
Quaker school in just nearby Poughkeepsie, New York. And when she lived here in Crawfordsville, she attended a Methodist church. But he never went with her to church, which probably angered her a good bit. But he refused to go because, and what he writes in his autobiography is that he liked to practice his faith in private.
Huh.
He enjoyed his privacy. He enjoyed his freedom away from that, and that he didn't think it was necessary to be a pious man, to be a Christian man. You didn't think it was, a requirement to go to church to
Yeah,
have those
yeah.
beliefs.
Well, do you think
Uh,
that oh, I'm sorry. No, do you think
Go
the
ahead.
Ottoman Empire experience certainly enhanced part of his whole, Middle Eastern understanding, if you will? I mean, about that certainly
Well,
had to have some influence, particularly when he's thinking about the Magi and, all the rest.
yeah. Well, so actually, the book is published in 1880. Ben-Hur is, and he sent President James Garfield comes across a copy, and I'm not sure if Lew sent it to him or what, but he reads it, loves it, and writes Lew a letter. And this is Lew at this time is the governor of New Mexico.
Oh, I got
Um,
you. Okay. Okay.
and Lew receives a letter from President James Garfield stating, "Your book Ben-Hur is phenomenal. I'm so impressed by it, and I'm so impressed by your knowledge. If you read Ben-Hur, you'll see the deep descriptions he has in it. I'm so impressed by your knowledge of the Middle East, of the Holy Land, of that time, of that part of the world. Would you like to be the diplomat to the Ottoman Empire?" So, because of Ben-Hur, he gets the job to be the
Ah,
ambassador to
It
the
wasn't
Ottoman
the other
Empire.
way that I was assuming. It wasn't like he was
Yeah,
there and then he
and
had some
what's
epiphany.
interesting is a part of that letter, and I'm going to get this quote wrong, but
It's okay.
part of that letter from James Garfield states, "Your book is so good, I want you to go there and write me another book. Go there and write me your next book. Write me a sequel to Ben-Hur." Well, that sequel wasn't really a sequel. It was a completely different book called The Prince of India. You know, all these, that doesn't come out till 1893, long after he's home from the Ottoman Empire. And he spends his time while he's there. He does a lot of this research. He's traveling. He's in their archives, what have you, on his free time. And when this book comes out, everyone thinks they're getting a sequel to Ben-Hur, and it ends up being a completely different book, not at all about the Christian faith. In fact, it's about the Turks overthrowing the Byzantines.
Right.
And a lot of people were very upset with it. And it flopped. I think the numbers are like it sold 100,000 copies in the first 6 months, and then it hasn't sold 100,000 copies since.
Wow.
So it flopped compared to Ben-Hur, which by the mid 1890s is selling thousands of copies per month, you know. Yeah.
How about that? How about that? So after he did some of that writing and kind of he kind of went in his own residency, right, of his soul searching spot where you're sitting right now, where he could kind of sit and reflect and think and create and do and whatever else that he wanted to do. How did the end of his life? What was that like? Was he still fighting off all of these denomination people, or was he just enjoying the proceeds of the book rights and fishing a good bit? And
I would say the end was a lot more comfortable for him than his younger years, especially those first few years after the Civil War. But you know, in the late 1890s, 1899, Ben-Hur is turned into a stage play, and Lew does get to see that, and has a quote saying, "My God, I set all this in motion," because it was such a tremendous production. The stage play, it ran, you know, it ran for 20 some years and was seen by tens of millions of people over the years. But it was a huge production. They had to figure out, how do we do a chariot race on stage?
right.
How do we do that? So what they did was they built a treadmill with a diorama spinning around behind the treadmill and had the horses running on the treadmills.
How about that?
So he sees that and is just blown away. There's a big issue with the book and with the stage play, and really all adaptations of Ben-Hur, of how do you portray Jesus so as to not offend anybody. And in the stage play, they end up, this is as the electric light is first being perfected, and they used rather than having a human actor portray Jesus, they had a very bright light in the corner do it, so as to keep people from being offended by it. But he starts to see in these later years of his life what Ben-Hur is turning into. It's turning into a commercial powerhouse, a merchandising powerhouse, and it's adapted into all these items, whether it's coffee, Ben-Hur spices, Ben-Hur jewelry, Ben-Hur perfumes, Ben-Hur bicycles. And he, at the very tail end of his life, is seeing what that eventually becomes. He does pass in 1905, right as the motion picture industry is starting to get its legs. And in 1907, it's made into the first silent film of Ben-Hur, and it was done so without the family's permission and without the rights. So Lew's son, Henry, ends up suing the makers of this movie,
Yeah.
and it becomes a part of the first Supreme Court case over copyright law.
How about that?
So was
He
about
keeps
Ben-Hur.
doing all these awesome things even in death, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah. And So the first Supreme Court case, and really that court case, it punishes the makers of it, but really it anoints motion picture as a legitimate art form, as a legitimate form of entertainment for the masses. Of course, that leads to Lew's son selling the rights for $600,000 in 1921 to be made into the first 1925 silent film, which was an absolute epic. It's actually my favorite Ben-Hur. If you've never seen it, I highly suggest it.
Okay.
And eventually that was remade into the 59 film, which is the big one that everyone knows.
Sure.
11 Academy Awards, famous film. And it's been remade since then too into animated series, another film in 2016, all of that. So
How about that? Well, hey, we have really enjoyed our conversation with Tom Meeks with the Lew Wallace Center and Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Tell us, for folks who are interested, how do they learn more about the museum and what you guys are doing?
sure. So you can always visit our website. It's www.ben-hur.com. And there's a ton of great info on there. There's blogs that are put up weekly, and all of our contact information, how to get to us. And please come and take a tour of this beautiful building. I don't know if the video will be shared, but it is,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I can't. It's too much of a glare.
That's okay.
But beautiful, beautiful building that he built late in life. So.
Yeah, just for us book nerds. I mean, just the cool stuff that you got on the shelf behind you is enough to make you want to be able to come in and check
I
it
think
all
we
out.
have over when the building was built. I'm sorry. Well, when the local Crawfordsville library was built, Lew had, and this is 1905, I think. Lew had more books in his collection in this study than even the city library did. I think we have over 2,500 books. I think right around there in our collection, and a lot of them have his writing in the margins, his signature at the front denoting as his book. So it's very interesting.
It is very interesting. Tom, thank you so much for spending time with us today and helping us all learn more about this great novel, Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, and certainly more about General Lew Wallace and the background on all of that. So that's part of why we do what we do, is to be able to share more information and let people learn more about that. So you can also find out more information about our center at the Center for Christian History.com. And we hope that you'll follow along for future podcast episodes and future episodes of our Christian History Chronicles to learn even more. Thanks so much.